So, contributing to open source for the first time can be daunting. Tobias Kunze is the developer behind Pre-Talks, the open source Django-based software powering the call for proposals and schedule for this weekend. And he's going to show us what we need to know for our first Django contribution. Please make Tobias feel welcome.
Hello, everybody. First off, let me introduce myself a tiny bit. I'm not a Django core developer. In fact, I only started working with Django a couple of years ago, and then I started contributing like on and off once or twice a year when I ran into other Django people and felt like, yeah, I really should do that. So I'm actually here as somebody who is not terribly experienced and a fairly new contributor, because I ran into a couple of problems when contributing and stumbling blocks here and there, and I just want to help you avoid those stumbling blocks. So this talk is primarily about Django, because Django is a bit special in its open source setup, in that it uses different systems for its tickets and its pull requests. So every slide will have an icon in the upper left corner, and it will be the paw for tickets, because the ticket system is track, and that's its logo. It will be the very Victorian octocat for GitHub, and then it will be the Django pony for any interactions you will have with the community. The picture is actually illustrations from the original Django days when Django began. So we have some people around who were here then, so they can confirm that. Right, so Django is a pretty cool project. I hope you agree, since you're sitting here. Or maybe you just agree that contributing to open source projects is good in general. And even though Django is a fairly stable and old project, it still requires community help to stay alive and healthy, right? Because if it stagnates, nobody wins. And the first thing you have to do if you want to contribute to Django is to acquire a ticket. Every contribution to Django, apart from basically tiny typo fixes, have a ticket on the Django ticket system. If you want to contribute a new feature, that's a different process that I can't go into here right now, but you might want to look up the DEP process, or so the Django enhancement proposal process, or get in touch with the Django developers mailing list. If you find a bug and you want to fix it, that still means opening a ticket first, because the ticket system is there, so we can refer back to it, right? So that we can figure out years after the fact why a certain commit was made and if there was discussion on it, and so on. So Django currently has just under 1,300 open tickets. So you might think that finding a ticket to work on is easy, but yeah, not quite. Because most of those tickets have been open for quite a long time, and most of them have been open for a good reason. So either they are far trickier than they look, or they don't look easy to begin with. So how do you get started? First off, you head over to code.djangoproject.com. Despite the name, that's not where our code lives, that's where the tickets live. And despite the fact that you are searching for a ticket, you're not clicking search, you're clicking view tickets. Bear with me, it's going to be all right. And if you do that, you'll arrive at this fancy interface, which allows you to build basically arbitrary queries against the ticket system. Tickets have states, and tickets have people who take care of them, and then tickets have flags, and you can filter for all of them or none of them. Among those flags is a flag called easy pickings. Now you might think that this is a good idea to get started with, and theoretically, yes, it is. But out of these 1,300, just under 1,300 open tickets, there are roughly 10 or maybe 6, depending on the day, easy pickings. Because naturally, you know, as easy pickings get open, people are like, oh, cool, an easy ticket, let me work on that, and boom, they're gone. So your chances of finding an actually open, easy ticket aren't that high. So the Django documentation, which isn't that helpful at this stage, but we'll get back to that later on, has the pretty good recommendation of filtering by tickets that are unassigned and open, which is the first filter you are offered by default, and then just choosing a component that you want to work on. Now, this is really good advice if you already know what you want to work on, right? If you say, I want to work on models and databases, so you choose the ORM, and you will find 180 tickets. Good luck choosing one. Or you might work on the documentation, which also has a lot of tickets, which makes this hard. But maybe you are interested in a smaller component like internationalization, where you will only find 5 unassigned or open tickets. So that is a good way to start. If you're not sure which component you want to work on, or if choosing among over 100 open tickets is too much for you to go through, there's another thing you can do. We have about 200 open pull requests at any point in time. But on the ticket system, we also have a flag. The flag is called hasPatch, which is basically has a pull request. And we have about 500, just over 500, I think, tickets marked hasPatch. So what happened with all the others that are not open pull requests? Well, those were pull requests at one point in time, but then they got closed because the original pull request author didn't respond anymore because life gets in the way. You open a pull request, you receive review 2 weeks later, but then you're on vacation or something, or you are writing an exam, and suddenly you've forgotten all about it, and then 3 months later or 6 months later, somebody comes along and closes the pull request as inactive. So those are tickets where some people already went through the trouble of implementing part of the change set, and then somebody else went through the trouble of reviewing that. So you can choose to build on that instead of starting, in the middle of nowhere. You can find those tickets either here on the ticket system or by just going to GitHub and filtering the closed pull requests by the word inactivity, because usually somebody will leave a comment that says closed due to inactivity. And so you can choose among those. But no matter how you arrive at your ticket, once you have chosen the ticket you want to work on, you need to assign it to yourself. That's just this small form way down the page on the ticket in the ticket system, where you can just click assign to, and by default it will put in your GitHub username. Just do that, because if you don't do that, chances are somebody else will start working on the ticket, and then that's a bit sad. Because the first person to open a pull request will feel a bit guilty if somebody else is around, and if you are the second person to open a pull request, you will feel a bit frustrated because somebody else already did all the work. Right, but now that you have got a ticket, you can start working on it. It's pretty hard to give good advice how to work on a ticket, because tickets are wildly different. Like tiny documentation tickets, and there are huge documentation tickets. There are super tricky ORM tickets that go deep into database specifics, and then there are tiny fixes in forms, and then there are horrible fixes in forms that will take you forever to wrap your head around. So I would like to refer you to the contributing documentation at this stage, because the contributing docs are a lot to go through, so they're not the best place to start. But once you have a ticket, they're super helpful because they're very specific. There are like 18,000 words on 13 pages, so that's really a small novella. But once you know what you're looking for, they're very helpful, because there's a one page to help you make commits. So if you don't have a lot of experience, or any experience really, with version control systems, they point you in the right directions on how to get started with Git and GitHub by pointing you at other documentation for that. And they tell you the style guides and so on. I have some general advice, though, and that's to be rigorous in your work. It's a matter of courtesy towards everybody else working on the project to put in a good effort. That doesn't mean at all that you can't make mistakes. Making mistakes in pull requests is basically what they're there for, right? Pull requests are there for you to make a mistake and somebody else to catch it and tell you about it, and you to work together and figure it out. But it will be less frustrating to you and everybody else if you take care to look at a couple of points before you submit your pull request. The first one of those, and this doesn't apply to documentation tickets, but anything else, to write tests or modify tests maybe. Because Django is a very, very stable software product, and it is that way and it stays that way by having well-tested code. nothing will get merged without having tests. Now, it's perfectly all right not to have tests at first and then figure out with help how to write tests, because that's not always straightforward. It might not even be clear where those tests are, because in Django, the tests are, Django itself is structured pretty well, but the tests are a bit all over the place. So you will have to search the code a bit to find tests that are similar to the ones you're looking to write, and then modify those, or maybe just add to existing tests. But in any case, you should write tests, and once you've written tests, you should run them. Like, you don't need to run all tests, because Django has a lot of tests. And especially, you don't need to run all tests against all databases, because we have the test runners for that. When you open a pull request, your pull request will be pushed to the Jenkins test runner, and then a lot of tests will be run against all kinds of databases and Python versions and so on. But locally, you should try to get the tests that concern your change set and the tests you wrote or modified to pass, because it's just super frustrating to push your pull request and then 5 hours later or something, some hours later, to see a test failure, and then to go back and modify a test, push again, and again 5 hours later, you've nearly forgotten what you've even worked on, you see another test failure, and so on. I mentioned documentation. In any case, regardless of this, if this is a documentation ticket or not, you should write documentation. If it's a typo fix, maybe not. But other than that, if you modify any code, people cannot take advantage of that if they don't know what you've done. Even if it's a tiny bug fix, that should probably go into the release notes so that people who ran into the same bug know that it's fixed by now. So tests and documentations are a minimum requirement for most pull requests to get merged. Next to that, you should also run linters, or mostly isort, which sorts imports, because it's really frustrating to open a pull request and then to see a red bill just because some import was in the wrong location, because come on, really. But we have isort, which sorts the imports for you, so it doesn't go and yell at you and say, this import is wrong, it just goes ahead and fixes it. You should also refer to the documentation page on coding style. This is something that's which you only need to listen to now, because in the near future, hopefully, Django will start to use black, which is an automatic code formatter. So instead, you will then just be able to run black and not think about code formatting. But we're not there yet. So right now, you should read the page on coding style, again, unless this is just, not just, but unless this is a documentation ticket, and figure out if your code matches that style. And finally, you should also make sure that your commit message complies to the commit message format, which is in the documentation. Again, it's just a tiny thing and frustrating if somebody else has to fix it. This checklist is really just a help for you. I'm pretty sure that I forgot any of these points at some point in time in a pull request I made. It just happens, and it's not horrible. It happens to everybody, and review is there to catch it. But you're making your life and the reviewer's life easier and frustration-free if you go through this checklist once before opening the pull request in the very end. And finally, while you're working on a pull request, it's likely, or it's probable, that you will run into something where you don't really know how to solve it. That just happens. Django is a huge and complex project, and some tickets are really hard and so on. It's perfectly valid to go and get help. There are a lot of channels now that you're here. You can maybe, if you're going to sprints, you should use the sprints to get help, because sprints are super cool to collaborate with experienced developers and go ahead and talk to them if you don't know what to do or if you run into a problem. But you can also use the various mailing lists, Django developers for larger questions, Django core mentorship, which is very undervalued for smaller questions, because there are experienced developers standing by, basically waiting for you to have any trouble with your pull request, hoping to guide you along. You can use the IRC channel Django Dev if you have a bit of time to wait for a response, because that can take a bit. Or you can also open a work-in-progress pull request. Basically, open a pull request and make a note. This is work in progress because this and this isn't working yet. Could you advise me on how to proceed? This has the advantage that everybody knows what you're talking about, because you can point at the code you wrote already and say, I'm not sure what this is supposed to do, and so on. And once you've opened your pull requests, I'm afraid you are going to have to wait a bit. Because Django is mostly run by volunteers, not entirely. We have the two wonderful fellows paid by the Django Software Foundation, Carlton and Marius, who are paid to take care of the project, basically, but they have a lot to do. They take care of incoming issues, they take care of pull requests, they do the entire release management, including security releases, including backports, and so on. So, this is a good thing. It's normal for software projects, especially open source projects, to just take some time until you get a reaction. So this is just basically expectation management. You can expect for it to take a couple of hours before you get a first response, or maybe a day, and it will, on a median over the last year, it took a bit over 2 weeks, not 2 years, 2 weeks for a pull request to get merged, because you go through a review cycle and so on. So 2 weeks is, I think, a good figure to look at. Smaller pull requests will be faster, mostly, hopefully, and larger will take longer. But while you're waiting, you can help the Django project, because you have maybe, hopefully, presumably haven't got anything else to do. Well, but you still can help the Django project. That would be really cool. And you can do that by way of ticket triage and by way of pull request review. Ticket triage is a pretty cool thing to do because there are a lot of tickets, just under 1,300. The Django fellows are very proud of having gone below that number. That's why I'm stressing it like that. And you can help them by going to dashboard.djangoproject.com, which provides handy links to pre-filtered lists of tickets. And you can, for instance, look at the unreviewed tickets, which are tickets that have just been opened and nobody else has looked at them yet. And what you can do there is you can either move them to accepted if you can reproduce the issue, or if you agree that this is a thing that should be introduced, and so on. Or you can find out that you can't reproduce it, or that this has been discussed previously, or you can close it as a duplicate because it has been fixed already, or it has its own ticket already. So by searching on the Django developers mailing list and on the ticket systems, you can figure out what to do with this ticket, and this is basically a way of keeping the Django project inbox clean. There are usually just about 20 tickets lying around there because the Django fellows are really good at working with those. And if you don't want to work with new tickets, you can do the opposite and work with very old tickets, because we have tickets that are have been opened 10 years ago, and the last activity on those tickets was 10 years ago. So it's not at all obvious that they are still relevant to anything, because Django has changed a lot in 10 years. So even if you take the ticket and just figure out if it still applies. Like recently, I closed a ticket that proposed that it would be a great idea if we could start rendering forms with templates instead of code, which has been around at this point for, I think, 3 years or so, but nobody got around to closing the ticket. So, and if you figure out if this ticket still applies, just leave a comment. Just say, yeah, on the current Django master, this would still be a good idea, or we don't have this feature yet, because if somebody comes along in another year, it would be really helpful to see, oh yeah, that's still a thing, or at least it was a thing a year ago, and not it was a thing 11 years ago. Right. And the other thing that you can do is you can review tickets, review pull requests. You can either go to, the best way to do this is to go to dashboard.djangoproject.com again, and then there's a link to patches needing review, which is basically all tickets where none of the flags have been set that indicate that something has been reviewed. So there are 3 flags for tickets that have been reviewed. Those are needs tests and needs docs and needs improvement. And if none of those flags have been set, or the ticket has not, is not in the state ready for check-in, which is the alternative, like it's a good pull request, you should just merge it, you can review it. The workflow is you find a ticket, you read through the code, which you need to do. You read through the ticket because you need the context of what was proposed and discussed. And then you arrive at a judgment, like this looks good, this doesn't look good, this person forgot this step in our handy pull request checklist, something like that. And then you both set the appropriate flags on track, on the ticket, and you leave a comment on GitHub. If you're really nice, you will remind the pull request author that they have to change the flags if they update their pull request. So if you set the flag needs tests and they push tests, they have to remove that flag, because otherwise that ticket will not end up in a review pipeline, and that will be bad. Other than that, again, review is as complex as submitting code, so I can't give any general advice apart from be very empathetic with the pull request author, because they took time and took on effort to make this happen, and be very clear, because you will lose some context in written communications. Don't play the blame game, don't point fingers, try to be very, very, use objective phrasing. Don't say, you forgot a doc string, say this method needs a doc string, which is much nicer, right? Be friendly and positive, just offer an opinion instead of offering the absolute judgment. And also have a look, because this is a really large topic where there are books and talks and everything. Look at the talk Code Review Skills for Pythonistas by Nina Zakarenko, because that's a really good talk that mentions a lot of things that are important. And if you hang around and review other pull requests and triage tickets and so on, and maybe just go outside, enjoy the sun, sooner or later your pull request will be reviewed. And again, treat the review like you treated reviewing other people, by taking it as a friendly review, assume positive intent, don't take it personally, because the Django community is really, really cool and good about things like that. They are not judging you. They are just offering friendly advice to improve your pull request so that it can be merged into Django. They are there to help. If both sides show empathy towards each other, this is a very rewarding and helpful process, and you can learn a lot. It's a conversation, so you don't have to do anything the reviewer says. It's perfectly all right to get back to them and say, yeah, but I'm of the opinion that this is good the way it is because. And it's also perfectly all right to ask for private clarification, especially, like I am not a native speaker, so sometimes things are just not quite clear, and maybe I'm not feeling comfortable with discussing this in public, so I'll ping the person privately and say, did you mean this, or did you mean that, or can you clarify? And then once we figured out where we didn't understand each other, I will post a summary of what we discussed so that everybody else is up to date with that. And if you stick around with that, sooner or later, your pull request will be merged. Congratulations. This is a moment, if you arrive at this moment, you really should take the time to enjoy it, because it's super cool. You helped a cool project to stay alive. You contributed. I'm sure you learned something, at least about the tools surrounding it, but probably about Django too, because you got into some Django details, especially with documentation pull requests. You will learn a lot, because to document something, you have to understand it, and that often leads down a deep, deep rabbit hole. In my and maybe our enthusiasm to get started, we kind of started at step 1. But this being programming, we left out the 0th step, which is, when should you contribute to Django? And I want to be very, very clear about this. This is not a matter of skill, like at all. Regardless of your experience with programming or anything, there is a Django ticket that you can work on if you want to. Especially documentation tickets are great for getting into Django and getting experience with that. But especially if you take the path of choosing a pull request somebody else has worked on, that's also a great way to get into this whole pull request thing and getting into contributions. What you should consider instead of your skill, which really, really is sufficient to contribute to Django, is if you have just currently the resources to contribute to Django. If you have the time and if you have the mental energy, if it's all right for you to kind of commit, it's all right to drop a pull request if you can't continue, but at first you commit to taking on this pull request and trying to see it through. And it's perfectly all right to decide that at the time you just don't have the resources, that you want to use Django but can't contribute currently. Or if you want to contribute, it's a really good strategy That was also recommended by Carlton, our Django fellow, in his talk at DjangoCon Europe this year, which you should also watch. It's really good. To set boundaries ahead of time. Like say, I'm going to contribute to Django and I'm going to spend, I don't know, at most an hour a week, or maybe more, or maybe less, depending on your circumstances. Or maybe a week is not a good time slice for you, but you'll figure it out. Because this prevents you from being very enthusiastic and saying, oh, this is a cool ticket, and this one too, and I'm going to open all the pull requests. And then 2 weeks later, the reviews are starting to, pile up, and you're going to be like, oh, what was this ticket about? Oh, I don't really want to do that right now. So by limiting yourself first, preventing yourself from getting overwhelmed or even burning out, but at first I think getting overwhelmed. That said, all of these things, I'd really like to encourage you to contribute to Django because it's a really good community. You will meet wonderful people. You will learn a lot because you will write code or documentation, and you will, in any case, read code, which is a super important skill to have when you work in any capacity with code, no matter if you are a documentarian or a coder or a technical writer or whatever. And you will help keep Django healthy, which is cool itself, and you will learn from the people directly, which is very different from learning from the documentation or personal experience, and it's a great thing to do. I also want to mention that code and pull requests are not the only ways to contribute to Django. You can also participate, for instance, in Django Girls workshops as an attendee or as a mentor. You can attend events or meetups, or you can organize them, which is also a very cool thing to do, if a lot of work. You can help with submission review for events, because community events like PyCon will ask other people to help them review incoming submissions, right, to figure out what is appropriate and what's a good talk. You can test Django, the Django master or Django pre-releases to figure out if they work with your projects. You can write cool third-party applications. You can find ideas that are good in other ecosystems and apply them to Django. Like figure out if they apply cleanly. We had a great talk on the Rust community today here. And many of those principles might be a very, very good idea for Django to embrace. And if you're in a position to do so, you could also try to get your company involved. Like if you are, and only if, you are in a position to do so and you use Django at work, it might be a good idea to talk to your company about supporting Django and the DSF financially or in any other capacity. So I'm nearly out of time here, so I'm going to refer you to my website where this presentation is online, where I've also collected a lot of links, which wouldn't work here very well in any case, so you can click them, which link you to helpful Django pages like the dashboard and a helpful timeline, some data analysis on the Django ticket system, and so on. And that's it. If you can, please join us at the sprints, because there is going to be Django sprinting going on. So work on Django where you can collaborate. Andrew is going to work on the big async thing. I am very unhappy with the state of the contributing documentation, so I'm going to work on that. And if you would like to join me, I'd be happy to help you. And there are people around who will help you find a ticket and work on it. Thank you.